this afternoon because we had a cancellation from London, and yeah.
I didn't get it.
No,
We also have malfunctioning phones.
Yes, no, don't worry. Anyway, nice to see you. Thanks for coming. No. Hello there. Where have I seen you before? Hello. Yes, on location at work.
It's the most fabulous place.
Yeah, no, it's good actually. Yeah, good.
Really love the aquatics.
We've got the running.
Oh, okay. Good. Yes, get back a bit then. No. No, don't worry. Okay, so I'll manage. Yeah, sure. Just. I think Jane's going to. She said she's going to grab it. And where am I supposed to sit? I don't know what I do. I can jump. Yeah, that's true. I'll just sit here. I think I'm wired up, but anyway, we'll see how it goes. Good. Just thought I'd say hello. You've been patiently waiting, sitting, watching. Hi. Emma. Okay, nice that you've come. Thank you so much. Sorry about all the technical hitches. Usual stuff. Well, yeah, touch wood if there is any real wood around. We will see. Yes, wherever you like. Yeah, sure. Hello, hi, Chingue. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, great. Well done. No, it's nice you've come. Getting a taste. I'm sorry, your thing is taking so long.
Sorry, I think it's the application.
But tier 1, we're holding out for.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, and when you get it, we're looking for.
The British Academy actually gave me the letter within like 2 days.
Yes.
So it really depends on the Home Office. Yeah.
It will happen in due course. One hope.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for
coming.
Yeah, of course. Whatever.
Catch a train.
Of course,
so
whatever.
I just want to say
Thank you
now.
so much for coming. It's really good.
Looking forward to.
Hope you enjoy it. Yeah, we'll sit anywhere you like.
Yeah.
Hi. Just come and say hi to you. Hello. Hi again, Marcia. Hello. Thank you for coming. No, it's great. Well, I hope it'll be a pleasure. I don't know yet. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Anyway, nice to see you. Hello, Francis. Hello. Well,
congratulations.
Welcome from Amsterdam.
Yes,
Yes,
it's a bit mad.
Yes,
yeah,
I know.
I went to, I was in Canada this weekend for a family funeral.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah, quick trip. Yeah. How frustrating, though. Yeah.
These things happen.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So I was glad you were gone, and I'm glad
Yes,
you finally got back.
okay,
So
well,
thank you for covering bits and pieces in the future.
Yeah, we'll catch up tomorrow. Sure. Oh, John, hi. Thank you for coming all the way from Hong Kong. I know. Yes. This is Jean. Hi, Jean. Hello, I'm Richard. Yes, a friend and colleague of John's from way back.
It should be live.
Oh, you have, yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, they're live.
Oh, look. How is it? How are you?
You're all mic'd up.
I think I am. Oh, yes,
Yeah,
be careful. It's a nice crowd. Oh, you sit wherever you like. I think Francis and I are in here. So you could come.
We'll go
You could go in the front row, yeah. Why not? Well done. Technical mess-ups, but we've managed it. Keeping it simple. Whoa. Hi, Stephen. How are you? Great to see you. Yes. Hi, Hilary. How nice you've come. I love everyone's connection with Norfolk. I know. That's really
only
good.
place.
Your birthplace. I better go down. It's true. Oh, yeah, well, hopefully, yeah. I've got nice people, friends, family. Well, yes, I do. They come from all sort of phases of my life and career. My family in the front row next to you. Yes. Ex-faculty deputy manager from IOE at the far end, Manjit Benning, who's terrific, and colleagues from Hong Kong. I think friends from Beverly, New York.
Lovely.
Students, a few. It's a mix. Oh, my mic is on.
That at the moment. I just turn.
Oh, I see, right. Oh, I had it on my belt, too. See if I can get one. Sure. Stick it on there.
There we go.
Okay, all right. I'll try it. Okay. Fair enough. All in the middle of the...
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay at the back? Excellent. So good evening and a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Professor Frances Bowen and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Social Sciences here at UEA. And it's my very great pleasure to be introducing Professor Richard Andrews to you tonight, not least because he's the head of one of the schools here in the Faculty of Social Sciences, the School of Education. So Richard was keen on geography, turns out, in the sixth form, and he wanted to be a forest ranger. But then he read John Donne's A Nocturnal on St. Lucy's Day and was converted to English language and literature. He went on a scholarship to Oxford University, where, as well as completing the degree, he volunteered for and subsequently led a scheme for helping migrant families to learn English. From there, he gained a double distinction on the PGCE at the University of Leeds, which led to 10 years of teaching English and drama. I didn't know about the drama connection, so now. 2 of them on the Isle of Dogs in East London, and 4 as head of English at Island International School in Hong Kong. Colleagues from those schools are here this evening, so welcome, and do check up that he hasn't gone too far astray. In 1987, Richard took up a lectureship at the University of Hull, and via a number of grants from the Leverhulme Trust on argumentation in sixth forms and in higher education, he gained a research professorship at Middlesex University in 1994. Since then, Richard has held chairs at Hull, York, and the UCL Institute of Education. And again, I believe there are colleagues from several of those places here with us this evening, so welcome. He's also taught at New York University at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Richard's research sits at the intersection of social sciences and the arts and humanities. So he feels delighted to have been appointed a professor at UEA, where he says he feels very much at home in our creative, interdisciplinary climate. He's an elected fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a member of the All Souls Group on Education Policy, and an associate member of the Centre for Science and Policy at Cambridge. He's also chair of the International Advisory Board and co-series editor for the Cambridge School Shakespeare series. The Chinese edition is to be launched later this year in Beijing. Relevant to today's lecture, Richard won the Edwin Hopkins Prize in Chicago in 1996 for an article on democracy and argumentation. He's also won 2 poetry prizes, another string I didn't know of to you, Bo. He's won 2 poetry prizes for the South China Morning Post, and more recently, the East Riding Philip Larkin Prize, though he wants you to know that the connection with Philip Larkin ends there. Richard is currently working on a book as part of a series on contemporary rhetoric, on polyrhythmicity. That's complex time relations in music, literature, and social sciences. For the last 2 years at UEA, Richard has won 3rd prize, that's 2 engraved tankards, for this is in capital letters, most sporting head of school in the student-led sporting challenge. But because of a timetabling clash this evening, neither Richard nor I could play in the touch rugby, and that's a shame, we would have enjoyed that. And we'll probably end up in 4th place and receive a recyclable paper cup. So as you see, Richard has many talents. It's my very great pleasure to invite Richard up to give his inaugural lecture to us this evening. So please do join me now in welcoming Professor Richard Andrews to give his inaugural lecture.
Thank you, Francis. It's probably a good thing I'm not playing touch rugby tonight, because the last time I played, I neither touched the ball nor any of the opponents. And afterwards, the student said to me, thanks for your contribution, Prof. You made a very strategic contribution to our club. So that was good to know. But I want to thank family, friends, colleagues, students, and especially Kesa Berg, Dawn Corby, Matthew Sillans, Nick War for technical help, and to the events team here at UEA, Rachel Watkins, Ruth Selwyn-Crome, Tanner Barnes. You've all been really helpful in putting this evening on for me. Thank you very much indeed. My talk's going to be, I hope, fairly simple. I'm going to try and keep to about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, give time for some questions afterwards. But that's the structure. I won't go through it. But just to say that rhetoric is a negative word in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. It implies sophistry, cant, surface manipulation of the facts, indeed alternative facts, Machiavellian persuasion. It's most closely associated with politics and has been associated since before Aristotle took it up as the art of persuasion in the public domain. We have a brilliant professor here at UEA, Alan Finlayson, who can't be here tonight, whose speciality is the critical examination of such political rhetoric. I don't get very close to political rhetoric in my own work, although I have read the work of the Washington University Discourse Analysis Group, WARDAG as they're called, and they usually analyze the rhetoric of American presidents. I was particularly taken by a footnote in their analysis of Reagan, which went something like this. It was the eve of a G7 summit in Washington, and George Shultz, the Secretary of State, said, Mr. President, you realize that tomorrow there's a G7 summit and all the world's leaders will be in the city. Would you like me to give you the briefing papers? And his answer was, George, didn't you realize the Sound of Music was on tonight? That's a different kind of rhetoric. And the rhetoric I want to talk about this evening is one which uses a broader conception of the term. Rhetoric as the arts of discourse, all discourse, personal discourse, poetic discourse, academic discourse, not just political discourse. My argument is that we need to consider what such a concept, used in a positive sense in many countries in the world, could offer us in personal, societal, and curricular terms. Both the broader arts of discourse view and the narrower political view have their inception before and during the classical period in Greece and then Rome, at least in European civilization, the so-called birth of democracy. For me, rhetoric provides a unifying theory of the arts of communication. I narrow it down a little to the arts of discourse because I want to emphasize the dialogic as well as the socio-political nature of everyday discourse and its founding in conversation, exchange, and a reaching for consensus and therefore action. And as I'm hinting, this is a theory that can embrace the everyday as well as all forms of artistic, social, and political expression. So first, how did I become interested in rhetoric? In my first week at university in the early 70s, all 250 English language and literature students were gathered in a lecture theatre, rather like this. And the lecturer at the front asked, does anyone wish to do a course in linguistics as part of their degree in literature? And I was in the 5th or 6th row and put my hand up, probably prematurely, because when I looked round, not a single other person had put their hand up. What followed was a year-long introduction to ethnography and structural psycho and sociolinguistics with a tutor, Avril Bruton, who I remember well at another college. And at my first tutorial with Avril Bruton, we sat opposite each other in armchairs, and I thought, well, we've got a whole year. And she leant underneath her armchair, and from the frill underneath it, I was wondering what she was going to bring out, but she brought out a crate of Guinness. And she said, I think this will make our tutorials go more smoothly, don't you? And I said, well, yeah, I'm sure it will. Her particular specialism and passion was the great vowel shift of 1350 to 1600. And I'm not sure I still understand quite what that was, but she explained it to me very simply as being, we now say the letter spelt B-I-R-D as bird, but before that period, it was pronounced Brid. Now, that was fascinating, but I couldn't really get so excited about the vowel shift as she was. But anyway, but in my first year at university, this was 1971-2, linguistics was on the cusp of a shift from Chomskyan structural linguistics to sociolinguistics via William Lebov's wonderful article, The Logic of Non-Standard English, a study of black vernacular in Harlem. It situated language in a political context. At the same time, I was beginning on the literature side of the degree, the long haul from Beowulf to Auden. It stopped there, by the way. More contemporary literature we didn't get hold of. But I was now aware of the great vowel shift, which none of my other students in the year were. And it helped me with kind of reading multimodal works like Blake's London. All these early influences, along with a start on my own writing, could have led me to literary stylistics, I suppose, the link between language, literature, linguistics, and literature. That was interesting to me, but not interesting enough. It seemed classificatory, narrow, somewhat fossilized, a throwback to rhetoric manuals of the late medieval period. Or it could have led me to political literary criticism, as espoused by Terry Eagleton. Instead, I began to see, very dimly at that point, that the combination of linguistics and literature could come under the overarching theory of rhetoric, not just as a means of understanding and analyzing discourse in various forms and contexts, but as a generative creative art, an explanatory theory, but also a kind of toolkit. I want to give examples of what I mean by this broader conception of rhetoric from two trips to Berlin, one some years ago and another last May, both to conferences at the Free University of Berlin. The first trip, a few years ago, I went on my own, and the second with my wife, Dodie. On that first visit, I recorded what I saw and heard in a cafe, and on that same visit, I wrote a poem about Berlin, two very different aspects of rhetoric. One, the notes in a cafe very loosely framed, the other highly framed. So first, here's some of my journal notes. I'm sitting in a cafe on a street in Berlin. First, the words. Every car is named, VW, Audi, Renault, and all have number plates which carry as many letters as numbers, country of origin within Europe, the European stars, regional identification. Shop signs are in German and English, with a hybrid mix of words, telephone numbers, and invitations to seek more information on Twitter, Facebook connections. There are banners announcing new shops and cafes about to open. On lampposts, there are road signs, political advertising. People pass by with clothes and bags that carry brand names. In the cafe, people are reading menus, books, novels, guides, newspapers, and magazines. In speech, there are groups of 2, 3, and 4 in the cafe. Some people on their own are talking into mobile phones. There's more than one language, a mix of languages sometimes. Some of the people walking by are on mobile phones too. There are ambient sounds, voices, laughter, car horns, ringtones, the sound of tires on cobbles and on tarmac, the noise of the cafe kitchen, rustle of papers. And beyond words and sounds are clothes, car designs, road design, buildings and scaffolding, indicating that a building's being restored or newly built, the non-verbal fabric of civilization. And then beyond these designed and made forms are people themselves, the human form in all its variety, dogs, birds hovering in the trees, the blue sky with clouds passing at a high level after a storm the previous day. All these notes I'm making with a biro on a waiter's notepad, which says, Rossler, Ihr Getränkespezialist, Ihr Partner in Berlin und Brandenburg. And then I transpose these notes into type on a MacBook Air in my hotel room via a conventional, at least for the 20th century and first part of the 21st, QWERTY keyboard. I'm conscious every now and then of Christopher Isherwood's I Am a Camera in Goodbye to Berlin, of the layered prehistory of voices and history and literature that precede me and that inform my own perceptions and communications. That's from my notebook. So I call this the rhetoric of the street. It hardly begins to account for the interlinked rhetoric of communication in an ordinary street in Berlin. I've hardly engaged with the people or the street, except to order a cup of tea, drink it, pay the bill, and leave. But even the bill is a record of a simple but also complex social transaction. So rhetoric is ever present in these moments in a number of ways. It preserves the balance of human communication. It reflects the schemata, is the schemata in speech act theory sense, enables the world to move on in a small way, combines highly rational behavior with bodily needs, eating, and pleasures, drinking, Darjeeling. Even the type of tea brings another part of the world, its production and its economy, into the frame, into the sensibility, into the political consciousness. The poem, a very different genre in that it's highly framed, was drafted later. A city of memorials. a crossroads in time. So much memory, it is impossible to live in the present. You either relive the past or stare blankly into the future. Blood, spirit, intellect are separate. Obsession with the body, over-reliance on the rational, a soulless interest in the material. Only in the Tiergarten, away from the regimented suburbs and the epic gateways, the Potsdamer Platz and the Reichstag, are the pleasures of bike tracks that intersect through the trees, the distant sound of chamber music, birds in the trees, and the promise of coffee and conversation at the very center of Europe. Rhetoric, I think, is a larger theoretical category than poetics, but it's still interested in rhythmic flow and structure, the difference between the journal notes and the poem, who is speaking to whom, heightened patterning within the poem. In other words, in the poem, as a socially and politically informed genre, not just an inward-looking text-based genre, rather as a genre operating as social action, in what the poem is answering. Poetics, on the other hand, has a narrower aperture, something more internal to the frame of the poem itself. On my second trip with Dodie, I was at the conference during the day, and we met for dinner in the evenings. Outside a restaurant, she showed me an art project that was more than an art project. In the pavement were inset small bronze plaques. In each were engraved the names of people who had lived in the house next to the pavement. It carried the date on which they were taken from the house and the date of their death in one of the camps. You cannot walk along the street in Berlin with all its memorials without stepping on these, or walking round them and pausing to reflect on the house, the people. There are similar stones inset into pavements all across Europe. This is part of the rhetoric of time, a historical dimension of memory, acknowledgement, framed in a simple plaque inset into the pavement. The rhetoric and poetics of time, what I would call relative time relations in everyday experience, in the structures of the novel, plays, and in the fugal structures of music, that's the topic I'm currently grappling with some difficulty in the book on multi-level rhythms that Francis mentioned. So rhetoric is about who is speaking to whom, about what, where, when, and how. It's not so much about why, although functionally sometimes it does answer that question, though not philosophically, though it could be. And I think Ficker's book, In Defense of Rhetoric, really kind of defends rhetoric in relation to Plato and philosophy, defends its presence in the academy, as it were. It's a pragmatic art. The speaker is really a proxy for the maker, the composer, the rhetor, whether you are a writer, speaker, active listener, engaged reader, visual artist, musician, sculptor, architect. Imagine the first utterance of cave women and men. As well as making tools and food, it would have involved pointing and spoken exchange, as well as depiction in cave paintings, marks on the ground, etc. For me, meaning and form are inextricably linked in rhetoric. Rhetoric's not just about form, nuances of form, embellishment or fossilized rules about form. It's about making meaning with available communicative resources, and thus is close to social semiotics. It might have been the case, as a Russian author suggests in Rhetoric and Rhythm in Byzantium, The Sound of Persuasion, that one of the triumphs of medieval rhetoric, some centuries after Byzantium in the 6th, 7th century, was the discovery that form alone can be used as a tool for invention. But that's not my argument, nor what makes contemporary rhetoric so compelling. It is rather the other way round, that the need to communicate comes first, and the form, format, and shape of that communication is then chosen based on the available resources, on social propriety or impropriety, on the functions of the communication, on the particular audience, etc. Most of the time, such discourse seems intuitive, spontaneous, in the heat of the moment, but actually it's a matter of rhetorical choice. Sometimes we make the wrong choices. In my first academic job at the University of Hull, it was a bit of a shock after teaching. I mean, one of the things I noticed about Hull was that everyone had a dog in their room and everyone smoked. I had to do a health and safety inspection at one point and found smoke emanating from various rooms along the corridor. But often my colleagues didn't speak to me very much. So I thought, at a disco, a sort of staff and student disco one night, I could see a colleague, I thought his name was Dennis, kind of walking towards me from a long way off, and I thought I'd greet him and say hello. This was about 6 months after I arrived. As he came close, unfortunately, out of my body, my mouth, instead of saying, hello, Dennis, came just a little monosyllable, boop, like that. And then he walked past me and into the disco. So I thought, well, that wasn't a very good start. Maybe a few weeks later, I met him at the photocopier, as you do, and we looked at each other, and he simply just said to me, "Didoop." I don't think we talked again for several years, possibly, but it really kind of made me think that's really exciting about academic discourse. You know, lots goes on. But last Tuesday evening, in an address to the nation on television, and I will be slightly political, I think Theresa May made a very bad rhetorical choice. First of all, she was late to the lectern. We were all waiting for it. And then she kind of dissed Parliament, basically. Rhetorically, I felt to myself as I was watching it, don't do that. You know, whatever you do, do not do that, because that's not going to help. Persuasion is one function of rhetoric, not the be-all and end-all. Persuasion, this is Aristotle, art of persuasion. Persuasion isn't even the principal function of argument and argumentation. Argumentation can also clarify, amuse. Is this the right room for an argument? There's an example. Articulate, as in mathematics, as well as persuade. Persuasion and argument fall within a theory of rhetoric. They don't account for all its functions and practices. But we can see how the art of persuasion, Aristotle's definition, has got rhetoric a bad name. Who wants to be persuaded against their will by arguments that are sophisticated yet spurious? So to sum up so far, rhetoric covers a spectrum from everyday communication to highly framed artworks. It's socially informed, and to the extent that the social is shaped by the economic and political, it carries those traces too. It provides an overarching or underpinning theory in the dynamic arts of discourse. Its subsections are political rhetoric, poetics, the personal rhetorics of choice, like communicative preferences. Okay, so onto my middle section, which is what are some of its key elements? And first of all, just echoing what Francis said about UEA, I think creativity. What the early experience at university taught me was that fiction is a representation of possible worlds. Each novel or play depicts a world that could be. It's a frame by which we reflect on the actual worlds in which we operate. It's always intrigued me that much of the rest of publishing is called non-fiction, as though fiction were the standard and all other written discourse was non- or substandard. I prefer a more positive categorization of non-fiction as documentary or travel writing and so on. I also think the epithet creative, and that's a very dangerous place to say this at UEA, is a little bit rich. Is it not the case that writing a manual is a creative act, or composing the specification for the construction of a building? That's Shenyang, China, just a beautiful photograph, I think. I mean, these are the guys putting up the scaffolding, but you know, there's a lot of work behind putting up a building, and I'm inspired by all my 3 children who were here this morning, here in terms of structural engineering, later one as an English and drama teacher and an actor, to inspire me to think about the world in different ways. And that is a very creative activity going on there. Creativity is core to rhetoric, and it's more than often takes the form of composition, literally putting things together. At primary school in the 50s and secondary school in the 60s, we were set compositions, a fried egg, a windy day. In these cases, and in many default cases in school and higher education, the default genres are the descriptive piece, the essay, the story, the autobiographical piece, compositions purely in words. And I have some lovely photographs from a book I did with the DFE about 10 years ago on getting going, it was called, generating ideas in writing, and just taking you through primary school, the cusp of secondary, 2 students working collaboratively together, look at the visuals in the background, the sort of pleasure in composing, and indeed right through to university. In terms of composition, I think that this is an English student. I like the hand in the hair. That kind of signifies to me sort of thoughts going on, but working from a book, reading, interpreting, remaking, in terms of making quotations on the page, gradually composing, and there's other books to read and so on. It's a real art form. But as I'll show later in the talk, when I consider the implications of rhetoric for the curriculum in schools and universities, the picture in terms of composition is changing. So let me talk about composition for a moment. Composition, this is work by a lecturer here at UEA, Clive Scott, in the Literature, Drama, Creative Writing department, where he takes poems and sort of overlays them with images, or maybe the other way around sometimes. I really like his work. I think it's sort of quite beautiful, and in fact, this wonderful statement by Mitchell really kind of sums up one aspect of rhetoric, the dialectic of word and image. I'll just read it to you, seems to be a constant in the fabric of signs that the culture weaves around itself. What varies is the precise nature of the weave. The history of culture is in part the story of a protracted struggle for dominance between pictorial and linguistic signs, each claiming for itself certain proprietary rights on a nature to which only it has access. I'll just leave the image with you while I'm talking about composition. So composition brings together words, still images, moving images, sounds, gestures, and movement in order to communicate. Each of these modes of communication has its own rules, its own artistry, and each takes time to learn. Chaucer had it right when he said, "The life's so short, the art so long to learn." But multimodal composition and the art of reading such compositions as a listener or an audience is what we do most of the time. In everyday discourse, we listen as well as read body language and gesture. In newspapers and magazines, online or in print, we combine word and image. In plays, films, opera, or on that street in Berlin, all of these modes might be operating at the same time. I want to pay tribute to how much I learned from Gunter Kress, who I think might be in the audience. Yes, just at the back there, at the Institute of Education, for inspiration of this dimension of what I'm talking about tonight. In an OECD publication 2000 in Europe called Literacy in the Information Age, 5 levels of literacy were posited. Level 2 was so-called functional literacy. Level 3 was the level of literacy you would expect of school leavers. Level 4 was the ability to read and interpret multimodal digital texts. I think that's kind of a level I'm just about at. And level 5 was the ability to compose such text to a high standard. It's a new definition. I like that definition of literacy. The rhetoric, as I said earlier, is about choice. As a theory of the arts of discourse, it's powerful because, like social semiotics, the theory that underpins contemporary communication and multimodality, it considers which combination of modes is most suitable at this time and in this place to convey to an audience the complex combinations of ideas, feelings, information, and needs that the speaker or maker or composer wishes to convey. Rhetoric provides that perspective and frame through which we can see who is speaking to whom, about what, where, when, and with what parameters. And if we misinterpret the framing, the whole act of communication can be skewed. So the key to the operation of rhetoric is the act of framing. I want to distinguish between frames, the noun, the thing, and the act of framing, the present participle of the verb. Because a good deal of discussion about framing in sociology is about frames, pre-existing schemata that shape our interactions. A typical schema or frame would be an encounter in a restaurant. Who sits where, the ritual of ordering, the type of conversation, interaction with the waiters or waitresses, the bill, etc. But the act of framing lends a more creative dimension. Within set frames, there's scope to change the nature of the frame, to set one's own parameters, to break the frame, to consider what is outside and inside the frame. For me, this is just another reason why contemporary rhetoric can use the same principles, but not the same contextual guidance as classical rhetoric. And let me just take you through a few framed artifacts. I mean, for the first one, actually, well, that's a window, like a door, like a building. Existence is framed for us in all sorts of different ways. There's a card I picked up in the Sainsbury Centre of an artist. I've got credits to all the visuals later. I'll show you looking through a window, a very typical trope in visual arts. And here's an image I've shown before. This is Jean Shrimpton, the English model at the Melbourne races in 1965. It's the subject of a wonderful article in a book I edited by Stephen Muker, an Australian academic, called, I think he calls it, The Rhetoric of a Moment in Fashion. The Power of Address. Nice pun. But what fascinates me in terms of framing and rhetoric about this photograph is the background. What I think we're looking at is conventional Melbourne racegoers and their dark glasses, their hats, what they're wearing. And what's foregrounded is London, in a sense. London circa 1965. But not only that, the pose is highly conscious. I mean, it's sort of redolent of a Botticelli pose, but even if you look in more detail, the big watch, the chain around the ankle, there's no stockings, tights. That's just a look that London was bringing to Melbourne at that particular time. The black handbag, non-matching with the rest of the outfit. It was a subject of huge controversy in Melbourne at the time. They thought it was shocking. She's obviously enjoying it. The photographer also, think of the framing of the photograph that took this particular moment. So I think it's really interesting, of course, to think how photography, of course, frames things so cleverly for us. Back in London, around the same time, a photographer took this nice, maybe conscious, maybe unconscious sort of dualism. Oops, there we're losing. Let's see if we can move this on. Oh yes, there we go. Sorry. This is from a photograph manual. Try and keep your dancers framed so that all of the important features of the movement are included in the shot. It's kind of interesting in a manual, actually, because the frame put around those dancers is a kind of vertical rectangle. I think also the kind of more landscape-like frame is an interesting one because it gives their whole shadows and puts them slightly off-center. So, you know, there are different ways of framing. And here's one of my favorite painters. Colleagues of mine who've been with us to galleries will know that Howard Hodgkin's breaking of the frame is just, I think he's one of the most sensational British artists of the last few years. The framing's sort of important. I don't want to gloss over rhetoric and argumentation, so I'll say a little bit about that. It's not to say that a study of classical rhetoric isn't without value now, nor that I'm not interested in political rhetoric. The nearest I've got to it is a review I undertook for the journal Visual Communication, edited by Gunter's colleague Kerry Jewett 3 years ago, of a book by Kathleen Lamp entitled A City of Marble, The Rhetoric of Augustan Rome. The book took rhetoric beyond word and image into artifacts, altars, coins, icons, buildings, and other manifestations of cultural and political power. Lamp's notion of rhetoric also extends to the use of the body in communication. Scars, beauty, sheer presence also count in her rhetorical firmament. One of the main points of the book is that far from a narrative of decline that many have taken to be characteristic of the late Roman Empire, that actually the vernacular voice never entirely disappears, and that public memory emerges from the intersection of official and vernacular cultural expression. Satire, for example, is seen as a powerful antidote to autocracy in the latter stages of Roman democracy. One of my heroes in argumentation is Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, and I think that his statement is so telling for these times, as it were. It's important to argument and learning, education, and I'll just read it to you. The rationality proper to the communicative practice of everyday life points to the practice of argumentation as a court of appeal that makes it possible to continue communicative action with other means when disagreement can no longer be headed off by everyday routines and yet is not to be settled by the direct or strategic use of force. In other words, I mean, it's a translation, obviously from the Germans. It doesn't sound that great in English, but I think what he's saying is the importance of communicative practice, of argumentation, of dialogue, reaching consensus in order that further action can take place, is something that could be as small as arguing how many litres of milk you need to buy at the supermarket. Is it 1 or is it 1.5? That's part of everyday life. Or scale it right up to major political, indeed, avoidance of war situations and how to deal with conflict resolution and other such major processes like apartheid or the Northern Ireland healing process. I think rhetoric, argumentation speak to these issues. So, to take stock, the middle part of my lecture has been about 4 elements of a rhetorical approach: creativity, composition, framing, and argumentation. Just as a bit of an interregnum, in my first lecturing post at Hull, after 10 years of teaching in schools, I set up a Centre for Studies in Rhetoric. And Francis will be amused, it was only just me, really, and one other researcher. So I now understand what centres should be like. But the first commission to this Centre for Studies in Rhetoric came from the A1 Waste Management Company, based on the A1 between Leeds and York, who wanted to know, they wrote to me and said, how could they frame a letter to the local council about a burning issue in waste management? Well, I thought, this is great, this is real rhetoric, I'm going to respond to that. So I helped them compose the letter. But it made me wonder, in my kind of fantasy, if they would ever sponsor a chair in rhetoric. Maybe I could get that at Hull. And if so, and perhaps I would become the A1 Waste Management Professor of Rhetoric. I think not a good idea. So I was very delighted when David Melville, who was going to come here, the Vice Chancellor of Middlesex, kind of rescued me from Hull and appointed me to Middlesex at that point, before I made that terrible error. Okay, let me go on to talk about the implications, as I see it, for schools and universities. However all-embracing and powerful rhetoric might be as a theory of the arts of discourse, how appropriate is it as a term to shape the next phase of development in the communication arts in schools and universities? The term, as mentioned at the start of the lecture, carries pejorative baggage. That baggage is that rhetoric diminished, at least in England, as a result of the split in the 19th century between language and literature in culture, reflected in my experience as a first-year undergraduate in Oxford. On the one hand, there was the rise in syntagmatic language study, leading to structural linguistics in the 20s and beyond. And at the same time, in the second half of the 19th century, there was a rise in literary study, largely driven by women and by workers' groups and the university extension movement, and partly a reaction to industrialization and to scientific dominance. The first degree in English was offered at Oxford in 1895. The literary movement culminated in a publication for schools in 1921 called English for the English. And the Newbolt Report, that same year, The Teaching of English in England, establishing English literature as the central civilizing subject in the school curriculum, at the eventual expense of classics, and perhaps also through the 20th century at the expense of English language study in schools. So when I refer to contemporary rhetoric, part of my intention is to distinguish it from classical rhetoric and to provide a unifying theory of communication to bring back those elements together. Classical rhetoric has had a hold on the European curriculum, and in turn through Scotland to the USA and to a lesser extent Canada, through the work of Alexander Bain's English Composition and Rhetoric, 1871. That's about the time that the fissure began in England between language and literature. So in the US, for example, there are departments of rhetoric and composition, and 18 months ago, I attended a conference on rhetoric and democracy in Sweden. The article from that conference is about to come out. There's a chair of logic and rhetoric at the University of Glasgow, which has been in existence continuously since 1727. So perhaps the best example of how classical rhetoric operates is still classical rhetoric for the modern student, first published in 1965 in the States, now in its 4th edition. But in England, we've sort of left that tradition behind. I just want to kind of, I look back at Aristotle and Cicero and Quintilian to see what therefore would classical rhetoric for the modern student actually about? What guidance could we get from it? The first couple of statements are from Aristotle. The speech has 2 parts. It's necessary to state the subject and then to prove it. Subject and proof. Later, he says, at most the parts are 4 in number: exordium, introduction, statement, proof, epilogue, though the statement might be divided into the narrative and the division being definition of terms, and a refutation might be added to make a 6-part oration. So far, Aristotle said it could be 2 parts, could be 4, but actually it could be 5 or 6. Cicero says the most complete argument then is that which consists of 5 parts: the proposition, the reason, the proof of the reason, the embellishment, and the resume. The fullest argument is 5-fold, but the briefest 3-fold, without the last 2 parts, and the mean 4-fold, lacking either the embellishment or the resume. I think that sort of guidance has informed classical rhetoric for the modern student. It's informed the 5-paragraph essay. It's a staple of US education. And it's sort of programmatic. But it's Quintilian who comes up with the last statement, which is one I really like. It is often necessary to employ such changes and transpositions when the cause itself obliges us to modify with art the arrangement prescribed by the rules of the art. In other words, anything goes in terms of structure. You can put anything together according to the particular function and needs. So the point I want to make here is that rhetoric must be remade for contemporary culture and education. It has to be a framework with allowance for flexibility according to purpose and context. In terms of the school curriculum, English as a subject, I think, perhaps needs an overhaul. The last 10 years or so have seen a narrowing of the literary canon to focus on English heritage, a typically backward-looking and myopic notion of what 16-year-olds should have read by the time they leave school. In fact, worse than myopic in some examination systems. In a recent curricular selection for English literature, GCSE, the work of Black British and Asian British writers like Monica Ali and John Agard has been couched as literature from other cultures, as if it weren't British, as if our literary heritage was mono-ethnic. Another frightening move has seen English language as the sine qua non for all students, sometimes framed as functional English or so-called basic skills, but with literature reserved for the top 20%. Bernard Bergonzi in Exploding English is not the only critic to worry about this tendency, describing English, remember 1920 was the key moment it came in, English as a university subject as being like the Spanish Empire in decline. And he said it might go on for a long time like this. And that worry is a real one. The Guardian reported last month that the number of students taking English language or literature at A-level had fallen 25% since 2013, a pattern mirrored in Wales and Northern Ireland, but not Scotland. I don't know whether in Scotland it's called English, but there's politics around that. Undergraduate enrolments have fallen from an all-time high of 51,000 in 2011-12 to 39,000 last year. And part of the reason perhaps is a rise in STEM subjects and the emphasis on a narrow notion of employability. In the US, humanities degrees accounted for 22% of all US degrees in the late 60s. They now account for less than 5%. Another factor in the decline of English is the disproportionate emphasis in schools on spelling, punctuation, and grammar, so-called SPAG, as if these surface features and the narrow emphasis on phonics as a means to learn to read, and by implication to become literate, were the only way to learn to read, write, and compose in the broader sense. This new formalism, a sort of Lego approach, can lead to some strange uses of language. I mean, I'm not against phonics, although phonics is a term that's kind of been framed out of the graphophonemic levels of language and phonological levels of language. But there are so many other levels of language in learning to read. The whole book, the sentence structure, paragraph structure, the context in which you read, with your mother, father, on your knee, the engagement with image, all of that is all about learning to read. It cannot be reduced to a single level of a kind of Lego set. Now, I know this is a bit of a rhetorical move. I've found an old phonics manual from a long time ago, and this, I must read it to you. Okay, so on the left, we've got sort of og sounds or ob sounds. Rab is my big dog. Hop, Rab, hop as I do. Did Rab hop? No, he ran. My dog and I ran as far as the bog and sat on a log. We sat on top of the log. A fog set in, so we got up. Let us jog on, Rab. It is wet in the fog. And if you think that was kind of like a strange language in which to learn to read, how about this one? Ned has a rod and Mab has a net. It is a big net. Let us sit by Ned on the sod. I mean, if I taught this in the East End when I was with my kids, it would be hilarious. Has he not got a big cod? Is it for Mab or for Fan? It is not for Mab, nor is it for Fan. It is for Dan. Dan has got the cod into the pan. The pan is hot, so do not go to it. These are images I just put in for your amusement of me teaching in around 1980 at George Green School on the Isle of Dogs. I mean, a job I absolutely loved. It was my second English teaching job. I had more hair in those days. And that's how I used to dress, turning up to school in cords and a sort of old jumper with leather patches on it. But I've got students here, John on the left, on the right, Jimmy, and in the middle, the girl, this is I think a year 9 class, I must be working with them on something or other, her name is Jane Martinson. She's now media editor for The Guardian. She worked as their New York editor and also has been their finance editor. She was in The Guardian just a day or two ago. Really nice to see her come on in that way. She must be about 50 by now, so it's really shocking to see this far back. But what I tried to do as an English teacher, I suppose, was get out of the classroom with them, or bring what was outside the classroom into the classroom to make, I now realize, I didn't use the word rhetoric at the time, but to make the rhetorical life of the school one that was connected to the street, to their own lives, and to the rest of culture and civilization. So we used to go to Dockland, or we brought storytellers into the room, or we'd go out to the newspaper editing offices in Fleet Street, really get a sense of what language was like. A further concern, I think, if you're learning about language, literature and culture in an Australian curriculum or in China, is it English that accurately describes what you are doing? We know from Janina Brock-Griffler that World English is rapidly diversifying into World Englishes, that English as a world language is being challenged by Mandarin, that Spanish and Arabic are the third and fourth world languages for the 21st century, that French and German registrations at GCSE are down. It's not just the Spanish Empire that's in decline. I think it's the Anglo-American Empire too. The rest of the world has moved on. What about universities? We know from British Council figures that every year more students worldwide travel as part of their first degree. Some travel internationally for their postgraduate studies, others take gap years. Comparative rhetoric, or world rhetorics, global rhetorics, non-Western rhetorics, note the plural, is a growing field. It started before George Kennedy's 1998 study, Comparative Rhetoric, in which he proposed that the field of rhetoric studies begin to expand its understanding of human communication and persuasive practices beyond the Greco-Roman context. It started well before then, this movement is gaining ground. So contemporary rhetoric, or the arts of discourse and communication, is a better ground to build on, a better overarching theory for the future of the communication arts, I would suggest. Rhetoric is generous intellectually. It embraces all languages. It is interested in translation. It can be multilingual, multimodal. It is interested in speech, listening, writing, reading, still and moving image, gesture, movement. And I haven't addressed music or mathematics, along with geometry and astronomy, the 4 higher divisions of the 7 liberal arts, with rhetoric as one of the lower divisions, along with logic and grammar. All the modes that in combination make up everyday interactions as well as all kinds of art forms, both highly practical as well as theoretical. So just to give you a couple of examples from higher education, in the foyer outside at lunchtime, I came to presentations of posters by BA first-year undergraduate students. All of them had composed, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually, posters compressing a lot of information, learning, references, all sorts, into a well-designed, concise, compact piece of work. And they've been assessed this afternoon. I thought that's a nice example of higher education assessment. I've been unable to show you this PhD from about 2008 because the software is no longer available. But this is a PhD by Anna Milson from University of North London called Picture in Voices, a multimodal approach to translating the Afro-Cuban tales of Lidia Cabrera. What she did was go to the archives of a storyteller and writer, Lidia Cabrera, in Havana, collect all of them and photographs and whatever. And the way she presented her PhD was like this. That is it. Because when you put this, can't show you, when you put this, or when you could put it into a disk drive in 2008, what opened up was her desk. And in it were touch points. There was like a post-it sticker which had her acknowledgements on. There was a drawer you could pull out and all the photographs were stacked in it. There was a computer. If you pressed that button, the whole thesis came up, all 80,000 words of it. And so on and so on. It was a really imaginative way of presenting. And I think now, 10 years on, well, I'm sort of surprised that, students aren't just submitting a web link to a work they've created that is their doctoral work. That book on the left was a book I did with colleagues a few years ago on just trying to imagine what does the digital dissertation look like? How is it different rhetorically from the conventional thesis and other aspects of e-learning work? In terms of rhetoric, I've tried to kind of explore it in different ways. The book on the left, I guess, is a bit like the topic tonight. Reframing Literacy uses Howard Hodgkin's Hello as its cover to say we need to rethink literacy. Developing Writers is about thinking about the digital age. And I'm more recently working on a subsection of rhetoric, which is to do with poetics. Rhetoric, I think, can provide a unifying theory for the field that can inform curricular decisions. In terms of education, John Arthos, in a recent book, published this year, which Victoria Carrington very generously gave to me, on the legacy of the French philosopher Ricoeur, sees rhetoric as working alongside a set of values in a model of what a liberal education should look like. Now, our Vice-Chancellor asked us, challenged us actually, to say we haven't reviewed our values for 10 years. And I just came across this and I thought, what a wonderful set of values in which to think about education moving forward. I like it so much, I'll just read it to you. The comportment of humility, openness and generosity, the mental habit of fairness, sympathy and anti-dogmatism, the personal discipline of rigor, precision and industry, the capacity for initiative, resourcefulness, creative imagination, the unimpeachable devotion to duty and selflessness, and a boundless willingness to mentor, advise, and support. That's a good starting point for thinking about values, I think. So what would a broader curriculum at university as well as school level, as Susanna Rustin suggests in The Guardian, look like? She didn't suggest this, but she thought, we need one. Look like if it were informed by rhetoric and a post-neoliberal spirit. I'd suggest a manifesto for rhetoric as the underpinning theory for the communicative arts might include the following. I won't read all of them, but just to capture some of them. An awareness of how communication is informed by the social and political. An understanding of how thought itself and the resolution of conflict via tolerance of different sets of values can be informed by rhetoric. A multimodal approach to communication. A practical approach that is shaped by real communication with a real audience. I'll run down. 3 from the bottom. At university level, a much faster adoption of multimodal forms of presentation as made possible through digitization. An international diverse canon in literature and the other arts, as well as multilingualism and translation. And an acknowledgement that creativity manifests itself in different genres and modes. Even in 50 years, the term rhetoric might still have pejorative associations and not be the best bet for the key part of a school and university curriculum. But it might have re-established itself in England as the powerhouse theory behind communication and the arts of discourse, connecting a conversation on a street to the greatest films, a jotted note to works of literature, the power of a dress or a pair of trousers for that matter, think Wallace and Gromit, to the work of a great photographer. And more than this, a turn toward contemporary rhetoric might stem the flow away from English as a school and university subject and discipline and reinvigorate the field, not least in leading toward employability, which is rewarding, stimulating on a personal level and good for the economy. Let me finish where I started by reminding you of the frames within which this talk was set. First with a poem, not because poetry is some elite form, but that it is highly framed, has explosive compression, is a dance in words, as Ted Hughes says. If I can just show you a poem, if I can get this up quickly, we'll make it work, by the young poet laureate of London. And it's based on a poem she wrote. She's called Selina Nwulu. And the poem goes, I'll just read the start of it. Let's play a game. Let's peel back the skin of this city and rearrange its insides till we've created a strange kind of beauty we don't recognize. Let's move this city's landmarks like chess pieces. Take the London Eye and roll it to the edge of the city. Drag the Tate into Zone 5. We're working with graphic designers in school.
Created a strange kind of beauty.
This is what they did.
Let's move this city's landmarks like chess pieces. Take the London Eye and roll it to the edges of the city. Drag the Tate into Zone 5. Have the Royal Opera House playing in outskirt basement halls. Grab some chicken and chips by the London Coliseum. Classrooms become their own theatres, so that young people can unfurl their aches into creative roars. For the shy ones, the pen becomes a microphone to their power, and those words travel further than the lulls of their stomachs. Instead, those notebook soliloquies become a future bouquet of verses blossoming into the mouths of thespians. Art galleries are not echo chambers of prestige. Instead, their doors have become a fleshy open smile, their tongues speaking in a language of visual miscellany. Graffiti masterpieces are hanging with Cézanne and Monet. There are Dali moustaches on corridors twitching and beckoning young people to find new works of art to get lost in. Workshops are being run by Barker, wide floors and windows for children to paint on. Young people are composing digital sonatas in their rooms, and we've taken their roofs off. We've unplugged their headphones so that those t-t-t-t in their ears have now become a siren of noise. The sky has broken into an orchestra of patois symphonies as ground-fused electro sprinkled with classical undertones, rap lyrics chasing Bhangra bouncing off of buildings. The sky, a new constellation of sounds, pulsating like shooting stars across this city. Let's play this game. Let's play everywhere. Till we do not know where the highs and lows of this city begin and end. Till the backbone of London is a helix of hybrid noises, words, neon colours and shapes for young people to skip and dance across. So that wherever they go, their footprints will leave traces of the city they played in. So that wherever they go, they're left reeking with this strange kind of beauty. And they will not live less. They will not live less. They will not live less.
That's what I mean by contemporary rhetoric. The creative act of framing and reframing possibilities in the selection of modes and audience. Transduction from one mode to another is the key to the nature of learning. Composition, a powerful theory with practical application, and a concentration on what matters now, as opposed to curricula that look back to the past for their shape and inspiration, and do not prepare us very well with the future. Let's also end with a brief reference to politics in a more positive mode. If we could not only understand and critique the machinations of political rhetoric, but if we could also help the next generations of school children and students to be better equipped to make new frames, break them, cross the borders of frames, and use rhetorical understanding to make things new, and, in Habermas's view, use argument to reach consensus for action, and thus change the world for the better through high-quality communication, then perhaps we can improve the quality of life at personal, domestic, local, public, and national, international levels. If we wish to live in a democratic society, if we wish voices to be heard, and I think it's already happening with young people, then rhetoric might just have an important role to play. Thank you.
Richard, that was a truly wonderful lecture. Of course, it's all things very good. Made me think, oh, I wish you had been my English teacher. All those years ago. And also, of course, makes me think of all those emails I send to Richard on a daily basis. Perhaps he probably looks at them and thinks,
yeah, I do.
Given the subject, it would be just wrong not to invite one or two questions. Question here.
So you talked about the 5 levels of literacy. I didn't quite catch whose levels they were. But why do you think that composition or creation is on a higher plane than understanding?
Yeah, okay, thank you. One always gets the most difficult questions from one's own children. I'll take 2 or 3, yeah.
Another question, but he's a talented person, so he doesn't take more than that.
Despite all of your very impressive argumentation, I'm amazed still that when we're referring to the history of Brexit today, and that political speech seems to be ever more important in its most simple formula. We're now talking about, yes, what happened at Mansion House. This strikes me as being the 19th century, and yet it remains the major example of rhetoric which we as a public generally experience.
Okay, thank you.
One more?
2 is good.
2 is good.
I'll work with 2. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, first to answer the question, why, in the European conception of literacy, which that was from, why is the creation of multimodal digital text at a higher level of literacy than the reception and interpretation of them? I think because, perhaps because we would expect and hope that most people would reach level 4, which is the interpretation of what's on your mobile phone, digital compositions like the one we've just seen, and you'd be able to read it, understand it, enjoy it, pull all the various elements together and sort of appreciate as well as critique it. And I think the reason they made the creative bit, to actually make that, demands an even deeper understanding of the way those elements are put together. So just as making something and then looking at made works by other artists or writers can be a great preface, like tilling the ground in order to understand it. Then you get to know it from the inside. It's like a craft. If it's writing, it's like the craft of writing. You're actually kind of doing it, therefore more able to understand how it is done and to interpret it. And in terms of current political rhetoric, I think in many ways, Gunter was very generous in the late 80s to contribute to a book on narrative and argument. And at that time, narrative sort of held sway. It was as if the argumentation in schools, not so much universities, but argumentation in schools had been sidelined by a belief in narrative. And I think what we're seeing now, a generation later, is narratives that are spun by political parties that aren't arguments as such. In fact, it's very difficult to argue with a narrative. The only way you can argue with a narrative is to create a counter-narrative, because a narrative creates a vow of obedience, to use Ricoeur's phrase, whereas an argument creates a vow of suspicion. So politicians very cleverly play the narrative I don't need to quote them, you know what they are. Again and again, to make them seep into the consciousness and therefore try and affect voting behavior. So I think maybe in many ways that's why the quality of rhetoric has diminished, and it's maybe it'll come back. We should stop and have drinks, perhaps. Yeah, we can talk more. We should. Why don't we do that?
You've taught me, on behalf of many of us, so many things this evening. Next time somebody points out that I've spelled something incorrectly, can't type, I should say, yes, but you've forgotten the vowel shift. 1350, 1600, and I know somebody who knows this thing. I think Francis mentioned that you feel at home at UEA.
Yeah.
And that's self-evident, and we're enormously proud that you are here at UEA in a very internationally successful ongoing career that you're here. That's a great joy to all of us. And I know from the conversations I hear all the time, there isn't a single syllable conversation between you and other colleagues, are there? many people deeply enjoy talking to you. And I think you've taught us, like all gifted people, to see things differently. How many of us go into a coffee shop and stare at a small glass screen and check emails? Maybe we should do more of sitting in a coffee shop and writing some notes, because that teaches us about beauty in the world, and that's a fundamentally good thing, and you teach people about the beauty in the world. And like all great lectures, we all leave here tonight just that little bit better people for having listened to you. So thank you very much, Richard. Taking the example from his first tutor from that other university, I'm sure rhetoric and discourse works much better with a glass in one hand, so I know Richard would absolutely love if you would join him for a drink outside. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.